Good morning and welcome to the 28th meeting of 2025 in Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have no apologies this morning. Our first agenda item is to agree to take agenda items 3, 4 and 5 in private. Agenda item 3 is consideration of the evidence heard this morning. Agenda Item 4 is consideration of a draft report on the committee's pre-budget scrutiny for 2026 to 27, and Item 5 is consideration of an approach for the committee's inquiry into neurodivergence in Scotland. Our members agreed to take these items in private. Thank you. We're all agreed. Our second agenda item this morning is our annual evidence session with the Scottish Human Rights Commission, following publication of its annual report for 2024-2025. I refer members to papers 1 and 2, and welcome to the meeting Professor Angela O'Hagan, Chair of the Commission, and Jan Savage, Executive Director. Thank you and welcome this morning. Can I invite Angela, please, to make a brief opening statement? Thank you.
Excuse me. Good morning, convener, and good morning, members. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having us back. Yes, we do seem to be regular guests, which we're very pleased about, and I think that reflects something that comes through very strongly in our annual report as well. That increased level of engagement with Parliament and with the key oversight committee. So we're very, very pleased to be here. As you know, excuse me. As you know, I've been in post since the 26th of August. 2024. So this annual report is partly, part of the period of this report covers the start of my tenure in this role, and which I've had the privilege to lead for that time. And what is clear from our report and from our engagement with this committee is that human rights are vital to the enjoyment of a good life for people in Scotland, and how far we are from that in Scotland, and that those rights that have been hard fought for and we thought were secured are increasingly precarious, and they're increasingly precarious in the everyday lives of people in Scotland. And our mission and vision, as we see it, is to make rights real in the everyday life of people in Scotland, wherever they are and whoever they are. The progress set out in what's set out in our annual report shows the progress in the first year of our 2024-2028 strategic plan, and shows that we have delivered successfully on our strategic objectives in that time period. And that includes developing a new theory of change to monitor and increase our impact, embedding a participation strategy in the way that we work and changing the way that the Commission works, engaging much more directly with communities across Scotland, and putting lived experience at the heart of our work. We have 3 key strategic pillars in our plan: people, purpose and performance. And you see that reflected in the annual report, not just in how it's structured, but in the content of the work and the way that the Commission works. So, for example, on people, you will see the engagement across Scotland, from across and throughout the Highlands and Islands, to Castlemilk, to Tranent, and across Scottish Gypsy Traveller communities. We worked with disabled people and people with experience of social care and their carers to measure the extent to which there's been any progress in relation to people coming out of institutional care and coming home. We've sought across all our work to frame the challenges not just as local issues, but as rights violations. Our spotlights, which have been our domestic monitoring, as we call it, but a series of research reports, have focused on the real rights challenges that people face in relation to social care, in relation to economic, social and cultural rights, access to justice. The purpose of the Commission, as we see it, is to hold Parliament and duty bearers to account for the rights realisations or gaps in rights realisations in people's lives. And in that, as I said earlier, we've seen significant increase in our engagement with the Scottish Parliament, an 85% increase in mentions of the Scottish Human Rights Commission at Parliament. The tangible outcomes of our findings and of our scrutiny has led to action on fatal accident inquiries following our death and custody review. We've seen debates in Parliament on economic, social and cultural rights, progress on human rights budgeting, the interest of this committee in people in institutional care, and we've contributed to a number of parliamentary bills, including assisted dying in the period of the annual report. We've contributed to the Scottish Government's mainstreaming strategy. We've worked closely with Audit Scotland around human rights budgeting, as well as with the Scottish Government Human Rights and Equalities Budgets Advisory Group. Performance is also about building a strong organisation and building a strong evidence base. Our international treaty monitoring has included economic, social and cultural rights in the Highlands and Islands, but contributions around cost of living to the Council of Europe inquiries, as well as to the treaty bodies on the elimination of racial discrimination and the rights of disabled people. We've been working through a project on the rights of gypsy travellers who were victims of the Tinker experiment, and that's not just an historic reality, but is a current reality for many people. Our spotlight on TikTok focused on the realisation of the rights of people with learning disabilities and autism to move away from institutions, and our Access to Justice spotlight, called Review, Recommend, Repeat, published in July 2024, showed that there had been very little progress on the international monitoring recommendations around custody and detention. Of the 29 recommendations that had been gathered together over a 10-year period, 24 were still on red. And so our work is continuing in that area, and our annual report reflects a number of outputs and products from our Access to Justice, including an advice map across Scotland and ongoing and some more recent publications around the complaints process and updating the prison rules. Collaboration domestically and across Scotland is very important to us, as is our international role. We work with rights holders, duty bearers and our sister national human rights institutions across GB and UK. We have presented and increasingly presented Scotland's evidence to UN treaty bodies on the rights of disabled people, the elimination of racial discrimination and economic and social and cultural rights. And our work is held in very high regard by the international communities, with our work being cited as good examples by our sister organisations and the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions and the General Assembly. So looking ahead, some of our spotlight work is continuing. Our strategic focus set out in year one on human rights and poverty is continuing. We're moving our economic, social and cultural rights monitoring work to the south of Scotland, and we're growing our evidence base to hold duty bearers accountable. And in closing, I'd like to draw committee's attention to the closing remarks in my foreword in our annual report, because I think this summarises where we feel we are as a commission, but also where we are in Scotland and for the Parliament and this committee. That we need to be alert to the changing external environment where rights and freedoms are under threat domestically and internationally, as respect for the rule of law and the dignity and equality of individuals, and particularly marginalised rights holders, are increasingly challenged in political and social discourses. We all need in Scotland to recognise the humanity of the person standing beside us and work together to ensure that respect is what unites us and gives us common purpose in our public authorities, government, parliament and our communities. And that commitment to recognise the humanity of the individual standing beside us is the core of our strategic plan and the core around which the work of the Scottish Human Rights Commission is presented in this annual report.
Okay, thank you. We will now move on to questions from members, and I'm going to kick us off here. You spoke a bit about your strategic objectives of purpose, people and performance. How do you measure success against those, and where are you seeing progress and perhaps challenges?
So in terms of measuring success, we have a number of formal auditing and performance measurement processes, as you would imagine. And we've laid our annual accounts to Parliament as part of the process of laying the annual report. We have and Jan can speak more to the specifics of the audit process. Internally, we have, as you would imagine, of a well-run public body. We have an updated risk register. We have key performance indicators that are regularly reported on through Commission. We have a whole range of other metrics, some of which we touch on in the annual report in relation to media monitoring our engagement with the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government. And as I mentioned in my statement, we have a theory of change. So what impact are we having with the organisations and individuals with whom we work and engage across Scotland? What have they learned? What have they how do they feel about what it is they're learning from, or their engagement with the Scottish Human Rights Commission? We've seen an almost 20% increase in our media coverage, and that obviously is really important. That means we're reaching more and different audiences. We've seen a very significant increase in our social media engagement, and using that increasingly as a tool to be telling people's stories, to making real and visible what human rights realisation and human rights denials look like in people's lives. But I don't know, Jan, do you want to come in on the specifics of some of the measurements?
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, so certainly, as Angela's outlined, we have the 3 strategic objectives: purpose, people, performance in the strategic plan, and a further one around strengthening the organisation. And sitting underneath each of those objectives is an ambition statement, and that then informs a suite of key performance indicators that we report on as a staff team, on the basis of some of the evidence that Angela has explained there into the Commission, so that we are accountable to the Commission in respect of how that's been managed. We also have an executive scorecard where we monitor not just the delivery of our outputs, so the number of reports that we said we would publish, for example, that's quite operational progress management, but what's been really critical to the Commission in this strategic planning cycle is how we're working. And so, for example, we monitor on purpose specifically how well the Commission is achieving its objective of working better with the Scottish Parliament. That was a really critical and different strategic objective under purpose. And as Angela says, the metrics are demonstrating that through diverting our resource away from where it had previously been, with supporting government perhaps to develop its policies, we have now seen that increase in mentions of the Scottish Human Rights Commission in Parliament by 85%, but that the Scottish Human Rights Commission evidence is now informing parliamentary business, whether that's been through members' business debate or whether that's been through informing evidence sessions of the Parliament, so at committees. So the evidence, the KPIs demonstrate that specific progress. On people, we don't just monitor how many spotlights, for example, that we have now published, but we track for the Commission how people have directly been involved in and informed the work of the Commission, and that for us has been quite a strategic shift, or quite a big strategic shift for the organisation. And so our KPI metrics demonstrate that we have to measure and monitor how often people are directly engaged in the work of the Commission. And then into performance, what we're seeing with performance now is that we are demonstrating a greater evidence base from the Commission in respect of Scotland's performance against its human rights obligations. So not just now on an international space, but doing more of that domestic monitoring locally. And probably one of the challenges that we're starting to see coming out of that is the implementation of the Commission's recommendations. That's quite a new space for the Commission through its spotlight work to make recommendations to duty bearers, to government, to Parliament on specific areas of human rights violations, and it will become an increasing priority for the Commission to monitor how those recommendations are being implemented. And at the moment, that's quite a new sort of relationship that the Commission has entered into with government, with Parliament. So I think there's a challenge and an opportunity in that evolving, and quite an exciting space actually for the Commission to be in, to consider how best to monitor and support the implementation of the Commission's recommendations.
Okay, thank you. You touched on there that there has been an increase in references to human rights and the Scottish Human Rights Commission in Parliament and government documents, 85% increase, which is quite incredible, really. What do you think accounts for the increase? And how do you interpret this increase in relation to human rights in actual policy making? I'll come to you, Angela.
Thank you, Convener. Well, what accounts for for that increase. Firstly, the range, the focus and the quality of the evidence that we bring to Parliament, and as Jan has said, that pivot towards Parliament, to support Parliament in its scrutiny, in your scrutiny of public bodies as duty bearers, and in the scrutiny of the extent to which individuals, the population across Scotland are seeing their rights realised. So our increased engagement directly with Parliament and with committees, but through the domestic monitoring, through the economic, social and cultural rights in the Highlands and Islands report, through our TikTok report on deinstitutionalisation and people with severe learning disabilities and or who are autistic in inappropriate institutional care or long-term institutional care, and the range of advice we've given through the legislative process. So there's been a lot more directed activity towards Parliament, and the committee engagement has increased as a result of that. And we've seen that most recently the last time I was in this room with yourselves, where we're looking at the Religious Observance Bill. And so what we're doing as the National Human Rights Institution is what we should be doing, which is that human rights analysis of the legislative proposals and bringing that to Parliament to support the parliamentary scrutiny process and the process of holding duty bearers accountable. Are we noticing it in policy? Well, in some ways that's also for yourselves to adjudicate and to scrutinise. Are you seeing human rights thinking, ways of thinking and doing, I always say, coming through in the legislative proposals that you're scrutinising? And there is a commitment from the Scottish Government in its mainstreaming or towards a mainstreaming strategy. And for us, and as we said in our response to that strategy, what that means is adopting a human rights-based approach as standard informs the decision-making about public expenditure and resource allocation, which prioritises outcomes for people to live well in their communities as their rights are respected, protected and fulfilled. And so that's the aspiration for policy making, and we are hopeful that that continues to be a work in progress. But again, it's for yourselves to engage in that scrutiny of legislative proposals as they come before Parliament and committees to see, is that really what's happening in practice in policy making?
Thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much, Karen, and good morning both. Thank you for joining us this morning and for your comments so far. My first question is around the new powers that the SHRC received under the UNCRC Act 2024. I'm just curious to understand how that piece of legislation has affected your work. Have you used the new powers yet? Do you have the resources? Do you have what you need to make best use, full use of those powers? And have you been able to do so?
Thank you, Maggie. So yes, the Scottish Human Rights Commission, as you know, were granted new powers via the passage of the Act. Mm-hmm. As a result of that, the Commission had negotiated with the Scottish Government that there would be a resource transfer into the Scottish Human Rights Commission for an initial period at least of 2 years to enable us to get up and running with what it takes to enact those powers. And for clarity, the powers relate to the opportunity for the first time to bring own name litigation under the terms of the UNCRC Act, so only those rights that are protected within the scope of that Act. The power, an extension of our existing power of intervention in existing legal proceedings, again related specifically to those rights which are protected in the scope of the UNCRC Act, and some new obligations to participate in consultation process around the development of children's rights scheme, etc. So that's basically the addition to the powers and duties of the Commission. Through the funding agreement with the Scottish Government and SPCB, we have been in a position to bring in a new member of staff to the Commission, and we advertised for that new team member. I think the Act came into force last summer. By the time we got the cash in and got the job advert out, it was springtime before we were in a position to recruit. But it's enabled the Commission to bring in a qualified practising human rights solicitor, experienced in court litigation, litigation, who's been really excited to join the Commission and create the space to develop new test cases and test the law, because this is the first time a human rights treaty has been incorporated into Scots law. It's a moment for us, all of us, in this space to then test the opportunities of that through the legal system. And at this stage, that team member has joined as building the networks across the children's litigation sector, so working with partners such as Scots Clan Child Law, together, our partners in the Scottish Children's Commissioner, and establishing, supporting the courts to get to grips with these new powers, ensuring that procedurally the courts and the tribunal system are aware of the notifications that need to come to the Commission and to the Children's Commissioner. And then for us, it's about mapping onto our strategic priorities, because we can't intervene in every case or take an interest in every issue, but mapping then into our strategic priorities where there may well be cases in the public interest that the Scottish Human Rights Commission would have an interest in. So we're now at the stage of regular scanning of what's happening through the courts, and regular advice now coming through to Commission meetings to give Commission members advice on cases that are emerging that may be of interest. At present, we haven't intervened and we haven't raised a case. However, there's intelligence coming through on a regular basis to the Commission about where those areas might be. We have also provided a lot of advice through that staff member into the religious education withdrawal bill, and actually her advice has been exceptional internally and I think externally too, in respect of providing Parliament with advice about the impact of that legislation on the integrity of the incorporation process. And I think it's also enabling the Commission to test in real time the implications of incorporation within the devolved context, and there are some challenges in respect of the scope of the legislation and what that means for access to justice, what cases can be taken through and can be progressed. So I would say it's early days, but we've done everything that we can with the support of SPCB and Scottish Government to bring resource into the Commission to take us forward, and we've got at least another 12 months to go, after which time we'll provide a report into SPCB and to the Scottish Government on the impact of that work.
Thanks, Jan. That's really helpful and quite exciting, as you say, laying that foundational, really vital foundational work. And I suppose that the evidence gathering and the scoping. I mean, you've done so much in the Spotlight projects already that you'll be identifying potential areas for either intervention or litigation.
Yeah.
Yes. Thanks for that. Going to move on then to ask about a couple of Spotlight projects and where you think they go next. Firstly, on the project on moving on from institutions to independent living. I was interested in a previous comment, Angela, you talked about it's interesting that the increased engagement that there seems to be with Parliament. And I'm wondering whether, given that too many people still remaining in institutional care, commitments from the Scottish Government aren't being borne out in people's lived experience or realities. Is there something that increased engagement is actually masking real action? And we're talking about stuff, but we aren't actually doing it. And particularly with the institutional care, where are the challenges? Where are the barriers preventing the action or the implementation or the recommendations that the Scottish Government is seeking to follow?
Thank you very much, Maggie. So the title of that report was TikTok, and that came from one of the participants in the project, Kate Sainsbury, whose son Louis has been in long-term care, and Kate has worked tirelessly to support Louis live independently. And we called it TikTok after something Kate said, because she said, TikTok, the clock is ticking. Time is passing while we sit and talk about this. And to reaffirm really what you said, Maggie, progress is slow. and continues to be slow. We're expecting a report, well, not a report, an action plan from the Scottish Government by the end of this month, as per the recommendations in the TikTok report. That was meant to be a fast action plan that would pick up on not just our recommendations and the framework using Article 19 around the right to independent living that set out where the gaps were and where needs were to be met. So we launched the report at the end of January. We've still not got an action plan by the end of, or by December. What we will be doing is our own evaluation of progress against the recommendations a year on from that report, and would encourage the committee to maintain your own focus and scrutiny. Having had that evidence session with ourselves, which Jan spoke at, was enormously helpful in raising the profile of those findings and challenging duty bearers to think about how resources are being used, where those resources are going. We're still waiting for the follow-up on the financial tracing as to how the coming home budgets have been used. And there are, and at the core of this, it's about taking a human rights-based approach to service design, to service monitoring, and to supporting individuals to realise their rights to independent living. And that requires a significant shift of resources within the duty bearers, but within the structure of how services are designed and set up, where provision is created, and creating that provision to support people to live independently requires a mindset as well to shift away from institutionalised care and to support people in the community and what that actually means. And that does mean that reallocation and, in cases, of course, in some contexts, of course, an increase in that resource. So while there's a narrative of political priority, there needs to be a structural shift, and that structural shift is about integrating human rights at the core. It's about integrating human rights into thinking about public service reform. It's about thinking human rights first in the provision and design of social care. And unless and until that happens, we're going to, I think, continue to find ourselves, whether it's in social care or across other issues, in the same loop of here are the recommendations. And we see that in the other report that I've just mentioned on review, recommend, repeat in places of detention. And we deliberately called it that and called out that cycle of review, recommend, repeat. And that's a cycle that we need to shift in duty bearers, and particularly in response to your question around people who are still experiencing long-term institutionalised care.
Thanks, Angela. I mean, I suppose, given the rhetoric and given the comments that so many people in this building and beyond duty bearers and those who support duty bearers, given the comments of wanting to make this change, wanting to make this shift. And I appreciate you haven't done your evaluation, your assessment 12 months on from your report yet, but is there something you can put your finger on? Is there? I mean, I suppose if the answer to that was yes, you would have done it by now. But is there something that's blocking that cultural shift, that move away from review, recommend, repeat cycle, in this, never mind detention and so many other areas where this is the case? Because it seems that we are just we know where we want to get to. Or we think we know where we want to get to, but there doesn't seem to be that pathway. And there's a reticence to publish an attempt at that pathway. 11 months on, we still haven't got a response from the Scottish Government. Is there something you can put your finger on, or is it just, it's a very, very big thing, this cultural change, this refocusing, reorienting towards rights realisation in everything we do, that it just takes time? It's just incredibly frustrating.
Yes to all of that.
Okay.
Really. It is a big thing. It is a cultural shift. It will take time. Human rights and the human rights framework is not new, but it's not been foregrounded in service design and evaluation. And the allocation, and colleagues in this room are very familiar with our work in human rights budgeting, and so that process of following resource allocation to see the extent to which rights are being respected, protected and fulfilled. I think what we're looking at, and this is a personal view, not one we touch on in or verbal phrase in this way in the reports, but there's a complex institutional and organisational structure here. There's a lot, it's a very cluttered landscape. And so the working in concert across those different bodies is challenging. But again, that's why we would say in the report, and what we did say in the report, that here is a framework for duty bearers to work across one another and with one another in security. And so having provided that framework, the intention there is to try to make that big thing, as you say, and that bit easier by plotting that pathway through that will challenge those path dependencies that are established ways of working between institutions, because this will take disruption in those ways of working in order to achieve these outcomes. And what Kate Sainsbury and her family and many other families have shown is that that disruption is possible, but at a huge personal cost and personal investment. And what we're seeing, and what we heard from the families that were a huge part of this process around our Spotlight project, was and members here will be very familiar with the perspective of family carers, and the pressure on those individuals, the knowledge that people have to acquire, the resilience that people need to engage with the relenting institutional structures that they have to confront. And we shouldn't be having to use language like resilience and confrontation when people are talking about realisation of rights and the securing the right to independent living. So political priority, political pressure and ongoing scrutiny from Parliament, I think, is key to this, as well as what we're doing elsewhere in trying to engage with COSLA, with others in government and across the sector to build their knowledge, build their confidence in taking this approach, and to making the progress that's needed. But I don't know, Jan, if there's something you want to add.
Just a few things. Yeah, I mean, you do wonder, and I think the Commission has shared these frustrations. 12 months later, we don't have the work plan. Yet part of the TikTok response was to provide the human rights framework and the Article 19 pathway to deliver change. So it's hugely disappointing. Political will, as Angela says, has got to be critical. So there's a phrase Angela uses very often, is the tolerance for human rights violations. We've pointed them out, we've evidenced them. 12 months on, we seem to have a tolerance, to allow those things to continue. And in that 12 months, there's been some missed opportunities in respect of some of the recommendations of the TikTok report, for example, around law reform. So this Parliament did have opportunities around National Care Service, for example. It did have opportunities around a learning disability, autism and neurodiversity bill, for example. There are long-standing promises in respect of reform of adults with incapacity legislation. All of that is wrapped up in the circumstances that contribute to the continuation of long-term detention and appropriately of people with learning disabilities and autism. So some of those moments have been lost over the course of the last 12 months. Access to justice is a core theme of all of the Spotlight reports, is a really critical issue for this population. As Angela said, the emotional toll on family members who are advocating for family members in that position is huge. It's not easy to access information about your rights. It is even harder to fight for those rights, and once you've done that, you're exhausted, and you're not going to be thinking about fighting for everyone else's. And that's now where the Commission, certainly through its Spotlight evidence and continuing to keep an eye on this, does continue to monitor, well, where might the Commission go next in respect of its own use of powers that it does have. And there's definitely gaps there in respect of the Commission's ability to move things forward in the public interest. You know, the team at the moment do keep a very, very close watch and brief on any cases that do make it through the legal system where a family member has managed to break through and would be pursuing the interests of their loved one around breaches of Article 19, but actually breaches of Article 3, which is something that we're concerned may well be happening and behind closed doors in places of detention just now, and that's inhuman and degrading treatment. So the worry, I suppose, is that it might take something like that in order to force the political will, but at the moment some of those levers don't exist, or they're too difficult for family members to pull. So it's an unhappy set of circumstances, and as we said earlier, now that we are in a position of developing more of an evidence base and having a clear set of recommendations, then we have to stick by that and continue to monitor implementation or lack of implementation, and that's the commitment of the Commission. So it's complex, but we'll certainly over the next number of months and years start to have a clearer picture about where the problems are in the system. And what will be fascinating for us is to see how that maps across all of our spotlights. You know, are there themes that start to emerge around redress and access to justice and, you know, political will? You know, we'll get a sense of that. So.
Thanks very much, both. That's really helpful, and I know it's something that committee will keep an eye on with our inquiry in the new year as well. My final question is on the human rights assessment that you are doing on the Tinker experiment. And Angela, you mentioned in your opening remarks the work that you've done with Gypsy traveller communities. And I think the apology in June, after many, many years of campaigning, paid tribute to people like Rosanna and Seamus McPhee and Dr. Lynn Tammy Connolly for that. I suppose I'm curious, how is your work intersecting with or integrating with the work that the Scottish Government has done, is doing? And I suppose picking up on a point you've just made, Jan, what do you mean by redress for victims? What would that look like, given the length of time that the Tinker experiment has been going on for? Thanks.
Thank you, Maggie. Our work is ongoing. With the community and working in partnership with Rajpot, a voluntary organisation that works to give Indigenous and cultural communities a voice. We're completely independent of Scottish Government in all ways, including in this area of work. There has been a separate report by the Scottish Government. There's been another report by St Andrews University. Our work is separate from both of those streams, and that's really, really important to the communities that work is independent, and the work that we have supported is around supporting community researchers, so Rosanna McPhee and Rona Ramsey, on an archiving project of the Tinker experiment, so building that evidence base. We have also committed to an independent legal analysis around the form that redress might take, and are in consultation with the community on the recommendations around that and what that might look by way of recompense and compensation, full apology and redress to individuals, questions around memorialisation, and recommendations around ensuring culturally appropriate accommodation and support for accommodation. So there's a range of recommendations that are the subject of live engagement with the community at the moment, and so we will be producing a report in the course of the next annual report period, hopefully sooner rather than later. So what is clear from that there has been an apology on behalf, but not to or by, and the community clearly are feel very strongly about that. So there's work still there to do. There's ongoing work, again independently of our work. Community organisations like Making Rights Real have been supporting some of the Scottish Gypsy Traveller communities in challenging the current state of settled accommodation sites, and there's been very significant intervention from the Scottish Housing Regulator in issuing notices of serious concern to Angus Council and Perth and Kinross. Fife Council, I beg your pardon, Fife Council and Perth and Kinross on the state of the settled accommodation. So there's a lot of pockets of activity around with the purpose of supporting Scottish Gypsy travellers name and claim their rights, evidencing the historic nature and the institutional collusion that was the Tinker experiment, and the ongoing realities for people in terms of their family life, their health, their early mortality and high morbidity rates, and the economic and social exclusion that individuals and families who were the subject of the Tinker experiment continue to experience.
Okay, thank you. I know we'll look forward to reading that report in due course. Thanks, Karen. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Questions from Rhoda, please.
Thank you. And can I thank you for your economic, social and cultural rights report into the Highlands and Islands, and a really helpful research. It showed gaps in housing, fuel poverty, healthcare, access to justice, lots of things that I think we'd kind of understood, but it's so good to have that written down, and I think it kind of give people strength and courage who have been fighting against those things for a long time. And it's been very helpful for parliamentarians as well, and we've had discussions within the Parliament on it. Can I ask, though, how the Scottish Government and other public authorities, how have they reacted to this, and are you aware of any commitments that are coming forward to address some of the issues highlighted?
Probably take this as a two-parter. The first thing to say is I think our appreciation to you, Ms Grant, Rhoda, for your intervention and engagement with this report. Your member's motion resulted in the first time there was a chamber debate on a Scottish Human Rights Commission report. And so that visibility of the role of the National Human Rights Institution in bringing to the full attention of Parliament was really important and a significant first step, and one we would like to see replicated across the findings of the NHRI, that our reports are regularly the focus of chamber debate in the Scottish Parliament. The next steps... Sorry, you were asking about the follow-through from the Scottish Government. There's maybe less to say on that than there is about our next steps. And again, I think Dan might have more to say on some of some of the missed opportunities there in terms of legislation and policy scrutiny, and the extent to which, are we seeing a difference in approach to one of the things that we highlighted as a systemic issue in the report, not just the systemic nature of rights denials, but in terms of policy making, where rural proofing is not necessarily, and we raised this with the Rural Affairs Committee, where rural proofing happens again at a distance. And I think what needs to happen again is that shift in mindset that we've already spoken about. And one of the things I've said a lot about this report is just because people live remotely, their rights should not be remote, and people should not be remote from power. And that came through very strongly in terms of decision-making and participation in decision-making. And so while there are opportunities, I think, through some of the local authorities and other duty bearers are engaging in, that's not from a human rights framework, and that's what we again have introduced not introduced, it's always been there, but what we've held up to duty bearers to say there is a different way of doing things. And again, by setting out the way that we did in that report was very deliberate to build the knowledge on these. This is what the International Convention rights are. This is what you need to do. And to meet these thresholds across adequacy, accessibility, appropriateness and quality of the services, and then where there are gaps. So it had that diagnostic, so what is the problem, and prognostic, what you need to do about it. And so that's what we will be revisiting, and what we would hope to be seeing coming through from the Scottish Government. But the extent to which we're seeing evidence of mainstreaming in policy making, what are the specific responses around some of the gaps, either in resourcing or design of services, again, seems to be taking a while. We're about to embark on the next phase, which will be the south of Scotland. And the desk-based part of that project has already started and will be evidence gathering into the new year and working with communities through the spring. And over the cycle of our strategic plan, we'll come back to that evaluation of this is what we found, what has happened as a result of these findings, and where we need to go next. So into the next parliamentary term, we'll still be looking for that close parliamentary eye and scrutiny on what progress is being actioned by duty bearers on the back of the Commission's findings. But I don't know if there's anything you want to ask, Jan.
Just a few things. So firstly, thank you for the positive reception of the work, and for your engagement and the engagement of your constituents in it too. And to hear that you feel it's given individuals strength and courage to name and claim their own rights, that's really, really great for us to hear, because that's what this is about too. It's about educating folk about their own rights, and to feel seen, and to educate the general public and duty bearers that these issues are human rights issues, and there is an international framework that can be really, really helpful locally in terms of informing service design and accountability. So, and in respect of the response that we've had so far, yes, certainly we published the report in November of 2024. In May of 2025, we did receive quite a fulsome written response from the Minister for Equalities, welcoming the report and welcoming the framework, and reassuring the Commission that it would be helpful in respect of its approach to ongoing policy making. It didn't necessarily engage in the points that we'd made around retrogression of particular rights, and in areas where we had seen actually things had been getting worse, and what was therefore the remedial action that the government and local partners were going to take to move that forward. So those continue to be live questions. It's been great to see local community members using the report in their own advocacy, and that's excellent, because it should continue to have life. And and as Angela said, the Commission will absolutely come back to this as we monitor our own implementation of our recommendations. And in the meantime, we encourage local people to keep doing what they're doing with it. And the Commission members did, post publication, go back across the island communities and the Highland communities and deliberately have conversations with local duty bearers and leaders of councils and health boards, etc. And I think fair to say that the reaction has been positive. I think quite a shift to see some of these issues through the lens of human rights, and so our hope is over the next 4 years that that this will have contributed to quite a different approach to decision making and policy making at a local level in respect of the realisation of those rights. But the proof will be in the pudding, and we've got the framework to be able to evidence that.
And will you be measuring that? As I know other duty bearers, local authorities and health boards and the like have welcomed the report, I think insofar as it gives them something to go to Scottish Government with. I'm not so convinced that they're using it as a barometer for their own work. So will you be monitoring that going forward to make sure changes are made?
Yes, that's very helpful to hear that more local perspective as well. Yes, I mean, as Jan said, I mean, following the publication of the report, myself and members of the Commission went back round, and I was meeting with local authority leaders and chief execs and health boards and other members of Parliament, etc., as well as individuals from communities. So I think there will be a lot more local monitoring, and already there's a really strong human rights defender community across the Highlands and Islands, and so this was definitely another tool in their box, and one that is being really effectively used. And so those relationships are ongoing. So at that informal level, we have that informal sort of feedback loop, but we will absolutely be looking to see what difference are duty bearers making in relation to the recommendations and findings in that report, and are they using, because we want to test the method as well. We want to make sure that framework is working for duty bearers. That was part of the intention, is not just giving, using it as a stick to beat people with. That's not going to bring about change. Bringing about change is about making sure that duty bearers have the information that they need, and a steer as to how to approach some of the changes that they need to make. And that was what we were trying to do with the framework and the way we presented the framework in that report. So we will absolutely be going maintaining that eye on how is it being used and what changes are being made at the local level, as well as pressing for greater clarity on how policy making is shifting at the national level.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now go to Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you for coming this morning. So my question is around the project on places of detention highlights a number of areas of serious concerns, including the widespread use of segregated or solitary confinement and lack of mental health care support for women. My question is around understanding that. What changes, if any, have you seen in response to the findings? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do a big sigh, because again, it's another huge issue. Our criminal justice system and our places of detention are experiencing severe strain and constraint in the resources across the prison estate, for example, and we have a number of concerns, as we have highlighted from the Review Recommend Repeat report, which took, as I said earlier, the findings from a range of international monitoring mechanisms over a 10-year period, and then looked to see of those recommendations which had been implemented and where concerns remained. And so that's what's highlighted in the annual report here. And as you've touched on there, on the widespread use of segregation, we've written in conjunction with the National the National Preventative Mechanism, as well as separately on separate concerns in concert with the Children's Commissioner about the use of segregation and restraint, the use of solitary confinement and other isolation measures, and the lack of exercise and time out of cell was highlighted in the recent visit, just out with the timing of this report, I think, but just early in the summer, or possibly in March. It's the CPT visit, where the international monitors were concerned again about the lack of time out of cell. We have raised these with the Scottish Prison Service, and they are very alert to these issues, as they are very alert to trying to manage the overcrowding crisis and the very high levels of inflow from the courts into prisons. And so there are ongoing issues in terms of overcrowding and resourcing and resource availability within the Scottish prison estate. We are members of, and I chair the Scotland subcommittee of the National Preventative Mechanism, which is a mechanism under the Convention for the Prevention of Torture, which convenes the inspectorate bodies. And both the Police Inspectorate and Prisons Inspectorate are concerned about a number of things, as we are. And so everybody, the Scottish Prison Service are aware of this, the inspectorate bodies are aware of this, the Scottish Government is aware of this, but it comes back to the point Maggie made earlier about what's it going to take to change that. There's resource going into the prison estate in terms of creating new prisons, HMP Glasgow and elsewhere. But that's not resolving the right now. And the right now are pressures on staffing and rostering within prisons, the inflow from the courts, and the overcrowding of population, which then results in some of these practices, which we continue to highlight as being of significant concern in relation to the rights of people in detention.
Thank you. And I will be talking about hospitals in a minute, but in relation to prisons, have you been consulted and has your input been requested in looking at the rights of everybody in hospitals? That's biological men, biological women and trans people. Have you been approached at all by the prison service for a comment or guidance?
In relation to hospital care?
In relation to prisons and the prison service.
The hospital care of people in detention?
I'll be talking about hospital care in a minute.
Oh, right, sorry.
This is just in relation to prisons and the Scottish Prison Service.
So have we been consulted
on the care and the human rights of biological men, women and trans prisoners?
Not specifically on health care?
No, in general.
We have a biannual meeting with the Scottish Prison Service, and so we discuss a range of issues from overcrowding to the realisation and care of all prisoners within the prison estate.
And is that included in that biannual?
Yes, that covers a range
so
of
topics. They have sought your opinion?
Not formally, and in terms of, I'm not quite sure what.
If I was the prison service, I would want, and the excellent work that you've done. Admittedly, you have only been in post. Is it less than a year? You've done great work on the Spotlight report and clarifying issues in a complex landscape. But in everything that you're doing, if I were the prison service, I would come to you as the independent organisation, independent of government and Parliament, and seek your input into a very complex topic, just to seek your advice. So the question is, have they sought your advice and requested your input?
We do that. The principal route that we do that is through this biannual meeting with the Chief Exec and ourselves. So I've met twice now with the management, with the head of the organisation, where we've raised a number of issues about the issues coming out of the review, recommend, repeat, overcrowding and the management of overcrowding, and our concerns about the human rights, ensuring human rights compliance in managing that crisis within the prison estate, the implications for all prisoners, so the categories, the way that you've categorised people there across, and the other area that the National Preventative Mechanism that I mentioned has raised, again, a number of concerns with the inspectorate bodies, and for them then to raise with Scottish Prison Service as well in relation to the use of seclusion, restraint. We've got a number of concerns around the time of prison transfers, time in custody, mental health transfer and healthcare transfers in prison, and some significant concerns around data and how data is collected across sites of detention and custody. And that includes particularly questions around deaths in detention and how causes of death are recorded. So there's a whole range of issues. And so we have written directly to the Scottish Prison Service on a number of issues, including most recently and out with the time frame of this annual report, but at the end of the summer there on the operation of orders of lifelong restriction sentences, as well as working very closely and in effective partnership with the Scottish Prison Service on the complaints process in prisons and updating the prison rules, which was a project, again, out with the time frame of this annual report, but which came out of the review, recommend, repeat on updating the prison rules, which we did in concert with Parkhead CAB.
Thank you. And that's a chunk of work in itself.
Big
so thank you. My second question is about hospitals. So there was a Women's Rights Network report, How Safe Are Our Scottish Hospitals? And I mention this because it is about humanity and people when they're at the most vulnerable in hospitals. And you are at your most vulnerable when you're either in prison, and I talked about prisons, but this is about hospitals. And it highlighted significant systematic failures in Scottish hospitals, and especially mental health wards, and was amplified by the Sunday Post's coverage. And there was a parliamentary debate, there was a roundtable event, there's a roundtable event tomorrow, including some of the health boards and Health Improvement Scotland and the new Patient Safety Commissioner. and it's focusing on mixed sex wards. So it's talking about humanity and safety and human rights. I mentioned the report, then the Sunday Post did an article. We had a big debate in Parliament framing the issue as both a public health issue but also a human rights issue. Yet the Scottish Human Rights Commission hasn't touched upon this yet. I realise you can't boil the ocean, but this is a big issue and has been a big issue this year. So my question, Professor O'Hagan, is you are independent of the Scottish Government and Parliament. Is this report on your radar, and do you think it should be?
The specific report of the Women's Rights Network report is news to me, but our strategic plan does frame rights at risk as one of our priority areas, and so when rights at risk are brought to us by members of the public or by duty bearers or by others, then we will take action. But this isn't something that has been brought directly to our attention.
Thank you. And there's a place tomorrow, 12 till 2, if you'd like a place. We'd like you to come, please. My the final question in this section relates to access to justice. And I've talked that prisons and hospitals are immediate, they're almost like burning bridges and need immediate action. This one is almost the direction of travel in relation to access to justice, and it relates to adults with incapacity work, and it's the largest case type by volume for civil legal aid, and lawyers who provide legal aid work in this area are not only struggling to make ends meet, but there's a direction of travel that basically will mean that access to justice for the most vulnerable, it will be withdrawn because there'll be no, or almost a few, like hen's teeth, lawyers who are prepared to do legal work in this area. Now, the Govan Law Centre Adults with Incapacity Unit raised in Scottish Legal News on the 11th of November, serious concerns in respect of the potential wider impact of the proposal to replace detailed fees with block fees. So, Jan, you're nodding. So, obviously, you're aware of this. And as I've said, solicitors doing this work are already in short supply and believe that the proposals are poor, being bulldozed through, and will exacerbate the current access to justice issues for the most vulnerable in society. Now, the lawyers from the Govan Law Centre, and they have produced a report, say that increased state intervention, which is the direction of travel, where an adult or those close to them cannot access justice, is unlikely to be compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights. And they talk about delays in the current system already have profound consequences for vulnerable individuals and wider society, such as bed blocking in hospitals. So the question is, what's the role of the EHRC when alarm bells like this are being sounded and access to justice is being further eroded? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms White. The role for the Scottish Human Rights Commission is to be alert to these rights at risk, and we are. Just in Commission yesterday, we were discussing this. We've made statements already, and within the time frame of this annual report on legal aid and our deep concerns about legal aid and the erosion of legal aid in terms of access to justice, particularly for the most marginalised communities and individuals. We're working increasingly across the community law sector to build our intelligence, as it were, what information we have. As you know, and we've discussed already this morning, some of the limitations in our powers in terms of taking cases in our own name and being able to provide advice to individuals. So we're limited in what the Scottish Human Rights Commission, as the National Human Rights Institution, is able to do directly by way of intervention, which is why, as I say, we're working increasingly closely with the community law sector and have been in discussions with colleagues there around how to support how we can intervene through their work and interventions, and how to support their work. In relation to adults with incapacity, we as a Commission are considering the follow-on actions from the questions that Ms Chapman had earlier on about our inquiry. So where, and as Jan has already highlighted, there's been legal reinforcing the legal or strengthening the legal basis around adults with adults with incapacity has been a missed sort of legislative opportunity, but we are continuing. One of our Commission members is a member of a newly established Scottish Government working group, so we need to let that working group start up to see if that's going to be effective and if that's going to be somewhere that the Commission should be. But in the meantime, we are looking to scope, we're looking around our own powers of inquiry, we're looking at our own strategic litigation and how we might intervene and support in other cases, and we are very alert to legal aid and the problems within legal aid, and that access to justice is found fundamentally floundering on the constraints and reduction in legal aid. So everything that you've mentioned from the Government Law Centre report is something that the Commission is actively cited on.
And then where the rubber hits the road on this particular issue for our committee, let's say we're raising a red flag now, you agree that it's a huge area in relation to access to justice. We're going into human rights budgeting. This is a case in point to say a decision is about to be made, poor consultation that's based on financial, it's block, basically averaging out cases and treating people like widgets, not human beings. And the solicitors are just, I would say, apoplectic. They're just massively concerned and have come to us and said, can you do anything about it? So can you raise red flags? And not only when you've raised red flags, how can we work together as you and us as a committee to say put the brakes on?
In relation, I know you're a strong supporter of a human rights-based human rights budgeting approach. So that scrutiny of how resources are being raised and allocated, are they meeting the requirement to respect, protect and fulfil human rights? So what funding is being allocated or being taken away from legal aid would be one place to increase and ensure very close scrutiny by this committee and other committees from a human rights perspective. So working across committees, I think, on this issue is absolutely central as well, working across finance and health committees as well as this committee, so that those flags are raised across Parliament, that there is a real concern about the lack of resource, meaning a lack of access to justice. And if we can further contribute to that, then we can certainly explore that further. I think, Jan, you've got...
It was just to support that and to acknowledge, I was nodding vigorously earlier because, yes, that issue was discussed at Commission just yesterday, and it's part of our job to sort of horizon scan and bring these matters to the attention of the Commission members. And members of the Commission have asked us through the staff team now to go and look at what sort of intervention could or would be helpful to make it at this stage. And I think the Parliament, as we were reflecting earlier around the progression of the Commission's role in providing that proactive advice to Parliament, that's the sort of space that you might expect to see us in realistically with this particular issue. So we need to make a recommendation into members as to what to do on this particular new issue for us in respect of adults with incapacity, access to legal aid, how that relates to the existing priority concerns of the Commission. But certainly, we're in a space now as a Commission that you can expect to see more proactive interventions, communication with the committee on this issue and others. But I would want to make sure the Commission have had a chance to talk about that again before I put anything on the record that we will do. But to reassure you, it's there.
Thank you. And just finally, before I pass to the convener, so I've raised 3 issues there for your horizon scan, as you call it, which is good to know. Women in prisons, women in hospitals, and thirdly, the huge issue with adults with incapacity and the legal aid system. Thank you. Back to you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. We now have questions from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, ladies, and it's good to see you back. And thank you for all the information you have provided so far. The mapping exercise on access to justice found that only 38 human rights services offer legal representation out of 262 services. As you have probably heard, evidence taken in this committee has indicated that people in rural areas are many times at an even more disadvantage compared to people in urban areas, as access is even more restricted. We heard, an example of a Highland woman in the Highlands who had contacted a solicitor 116 times regarding her divorce case. And this is not an isolated incident. Sometimes women are out there contacting sometimes between 30 to 60 solicitors to get that legal aid lawyer, and are sometimes successful, sometimes unsuccessful. And as you know, it takes a lot for a woman to come forward, especially when they have been domestically abused and they are at their most vulnerable time. And for them to not have this access, it just puts them really, behind to then think of, why am I doing this? And not to basically, maybe they start thinking that women think that why go forward when there's not a service there to help us. So I wanted to ask yourself, so what steps do you think should be taken to improve access to justice, especially in the rural areas?
Thank you very much, Ms Gossel. Yes, in our annual report for the 24-25 period, we've talked about the Access to Justice map, which was published in September 2024, showing, as you say, the very significant gaps. And I think these gaps point to the consequences of the withdrawal of funding and withdrawal of services across local authorities and other agencies, and the severe constraints under which the community advice and community law sector is functioning, which relates to Ms White's point as well about legal aid and access to justice, and they're all bound up in one another. There's ongoing conversations with ourselves, but with others as well, around the next generation of legal practitioners as well, and having a focus within the curricula as well as within practice on human rights law, and taking an approach to practice that is rooted in human rights. One of the other areas that of work within this period of the annual report has been around fatal accident inquiries, and we've just published in the last day. So it's not in this annual so the work was done across the year and culminated in a family listening day in October, and that's what we published yesterday. So our ongoing work on fatal accident inquiries has revealed again another very significant access to justice advice gap, with families really struggling to find local solicitors with sufficient knowledge and confidence in the fatal accident process, and again the implications there, the interface with legal aid. So again, it's a huge issue, and individuals and other individuals will have their own experiences, but if you take an intersectional equalities approach, then you can see the ways in which particular groups of people are further disadvantaged by the absence of effective and accessible, adequate and appropriate legal advice and access to legal aid. And so that is where we do have concerns, because that's about the realisation of economic, social and cultural rights, but also, as we highlighted in our first State of the Nation report this time last year on civil and political rights, that those very significant gaps in legal aid and access to justice affect people in lots of different ways. So you've highlighted the example of women experiencing domestic abuse. We also highlighted that alongside questions around housing accessibility, secure tenancy, and a whole range of issues around housing rights in last year's State of the Nation, which speak directly to that point about access to justice and advice.
No, thank you for that, Professor Angela. I did ask a question, I think it was last week, in relation to what you've just said there in your response about kind of joint working, that especially when looking at areas you've just mentioned, housing, you know, and GP, nothing works in silo. Everything has, well, to be honest, I think some things do work in silo. We want them to work joint, with a joint up approach, because there's no use obviously dealing with a domestic abuse case when we need to take the survivor away from the perpetrator, and it may require housing as well. Right now, as you know, there's many housing shortages in the rural areas, so one service doesn't work without another. Exactly. So I wanted just to hear a little bit more about that joint working. I've brought this up with the Minister, Cook Stewart, quite a few times in relation to starting right at the top, because it's about budgeting, making sure that we're setting in here, the Scottish Government is setting the right budgets, but also speaking department to department, which, to be honest, majority of times we've seen now from evidence isn't the case. And budgets, are created and for different areas and departments, but maybe not speaking to each other. And then on the ground, as you can see, that it's a broken up approach, that we've spoken about, that, people that are experiencing domestic abuse may not get a house, people may not get a GP appointment, or, transport links as well. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more from yourself, Jan, or from Angela, in relation to how important joint up working is for the Scottish Government to implement, especially from the top down to the ground.
Well, I think you would find no disagreement from anything that the Commission has said on that point. And I wonder, it might be relevant here to raise the work of the Commission in its reporting to the Council of Europe and the Istanbul Convention, so particularly to the points that you've raised around women's rights and survivors of domestic abuse in particular, and to refer you to the Scottish Government's recently published response to the recommendations of the Grevio Committee, which is the committee at Council of Europe that monitors Istanbul. To the Government's credit, they pulled together quite a significant seminar just last week of key actors across the public sector and civil society, advice providers and so on, and survivors, to talk about how to get over those issues that you've talked about, the problems that inevitably get in the way of siloed working, that prevents progress in the way that all of us would like to see, and actually not what all of us would like to see, but as are required by international conventions such as Istanbul and CEDAW. So to reassure you, the Commission absolutely makes those recommendations into those processes, holds the Government to account on the progress that it is making or not in respect of its commitments in that respect, and that there is a live action plan now that's in development at Scottish Government level, using that framework of Istanbul and the recommendations, which was a baseline assessment for Scotland, the first time that particular treaty has been assessed. And our message into that session, which was attended by the Minister, was, in this space, that accountability is your friend. So that framework provided by Istanbul and the recommendations of the Grevio Committee give that improvement pathway. That's what human rights can do, and so there is a pathway to work our way through that. It requires political leadership at the top, and it requires all the right decisions to be made around budgets. It requires all the right decisions to be made about bringing the right people together at the right time to have those conversations. Certainly the political commitment was there last week. Our job will be to continue to monitor the progress that's made, but just to reassure that those issues are very, very live at the moment, and have been recognised by the Commission in its approach to influencing both of those processes.
No, thank you, Jan. Can I just come back in? Is that all right? Thank you. Good to see that you've put some good, robust, there's recommendations in there to put forward. You talk about holding the, Scottish Government to account, yeah. And you've said that you certainly hope that basically they will implement. I mean, from where we see, especially myself talking on the committee, from the evidence we're taking, I haven't seen in the last couple of years, I've been talking about this in this committee, that anything's changed. Unfortunately, people are feeling it on the ground even more in rural areas. And just obviously you'll keep bringing the situation up to the government. Is there anything else that you could do to push the government to making sure that they're implementing and delivering?
On domestic abuse specifically?
No, just overall, just the services.
Overall.
We're talking about basically the joint working more.
On joint working, absolutely. And you came into that looking through the lens of human rights budgeting. And I've been in front of this committee before, as have my colleagues from the Commission, a number of times, and that's where we are pushing very hard. And in the report, in the time period in focus in this annual report, we produced our second version, or second run through of the International Budget Partnerships Global Open Budget Survey. So again, how transparent are budget documents, how participatory is the budget process, and how are those policy commitments then evidenced in budget action. So maintaining that focus is absolutely crucial. And one of the really important relationships that we've developed in this reporting period is with Audit Scotland. And there and with the Public Accounts Committee, within the Parliament, and having that scrutiny across how public bodies are functioning in terms of not working in silos but working across portfolios, working across service design, because people don't exist in those isolated categories, and services need to be designed and structured in such a way that they start with what are the rights and what's the compliance, but what's people's experience within that service, which also speaks back to Tess White's points earlier on about hospital care or prison care or wherever it happens to be, and where people are in the care of the state, as well as public services across the piece. So what we have been doing is providing these multiple frameworks across our spotlights. So drawing on the international conventions on economic, social and cultural rights, setting out that framework of appropriate, adequate, quality standards for public services to do that effectively requires duty bearers, public authorities, to think in the round, to think across services, and to look at how resource allocation supports that.
Just a reflection, I suppose, on which is a common theme for us now coming through the work of the Commission in that accountability space. So, working to hold government to account on the impact of its actions, and it's that accountability gap that I think you're referring to. One of the challenges, I suppose, that the Scottish Human Rights Commission experiences in that space is that there's no requirement really on the government to respond to the recommendations or the outputs of the Scottish Human Rights Commission. So, fortunately, they've been very polite and very respectful, and they have responded to much of what we have recommended over the last 18 months or so. But there's no requirement on them to do so, and there's no public space for that to happen. So, we hope that the next session of Parliament will give Parliament an option to, or some time to look at the mandate of the Commission and how that might progress. But in addition to that, or as an alternative to that, continuing to work with this committee to create the space for greater accountability of government progress against Scottish Human Rights Commission recommendations, and really getting to surface what the challenges are, because that will help all of us in respect of real scrutiny, in respect of what's the problem to come up. That's an issue that's come up in various lines of questioning today, but what we're struggling to get to quite often is the barrier, an understanding of the barrier, so that we can move things forward. So that would just be an observation about how we could perhaps work together as institutionally over the next session of Parliament to improve upon that.
Thank you very much, ladies. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have questions from Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Welcome back to the committee. Professor O'Hagan, you mentioned in your opening contribution that next year the Commission will focus on poverty and human rights, and I'm interested to hear a bit more detail about the proposed work there on these really important issues.
Thank you very much, Ms McNair. Good morning. The commitment to a spotlight in poverty and human rights is in our 24-28 strategic plan. We've been very busy with all the other Spotlight reports, which will feed into that, because obviously the economic, social and cultural rights evidence base is there, is generating an evidence base that's helping us sort of refine where we can make a difference, where we can add value to the huge amount of work that goes on across civil society and third sector organisations in relation to poverty, and what evidence there is around, for example, the child poverty targets and the national performance framework as well, all of which are the mechanisms that should hopefully drive government policy and focus parliamentary scrutiny. So the very first thing we've done is listen. Well, the very first thing we've done is, as I say, our evidence base, then listen to what our whole range of organisations are saying, and just, again, out with the reporting period that we're talking about today, but where we've started is with a round table, which I convened about 6 weeks ago with a whole range of third sector organisations to work through with them what work they're doing and where the Commission can add value. And I think the first thing that we can do is to map out for duty bearers and for rights holders and human rights defenders that poverty is a human rights issue, that how the experience of poverty and the responses to poverty, and again to speak back to Ms Gosl's point about working across portfolios, has to be that concerted effort. And so where there are rights to housing, to shelter, to food, to safety, to living with dignity, etc., etc., these are human rights, and they are human rights that are not being experienced by people who are living in poverty. So our spotlight on poverty will take a different form in that we've had an emphasis on a primary research base for our previous spotlights, and quite big, chunky reports as a result of that. Most likely, and what we've discussed in Commission, is that there'll be a number of different types of outputs from this report, but key to it will be the ways of working of the Commission, so participation, working with a range of organisations and a range of rights holders in surfacing that evidence in that intersectional cross-service way. I think that will very much characterise how we will work on our forthcoming Spotlight on Poverty.
Thank you. I look forward to that as well. I'll keep an eye on it. Obviously, we're aware of the Commission's disappointment following on from the announcement from the Scottish Government that they're postponing, the Human Rights Bill until the next parliamentary session. You mentioned the framework already, but what impact does that have on the actual framework, and what engagement have you had with the Scottish Government on it?
Engagement around incorporation.
Yes,
so within the period of the annual report, so that was when the announcement was made by the Scottish Government to step back from the commitment to bring forward incorporation in the current parliamentary period. So we've had ongoing conversations at Cabinet level, including with the First Minister, Cabinet Secretary and the Minister for Equalities. We've had ongoing conversations with officials following the publication of the discussion paper by the Scottish Government at the start of the summer. And as a Commission, we've been looking at our own positions and our own evidence base formulated over many years around incorporation. And it is clear to us, and hopefully to this committee, that incorporation has already begun with the incorporation of the UNCRC Scotland Act, but that incorporation is the kind of panacea. There are opportunities for this Parliament and the Scottish Government to ensure that human rights are integrated across legislation, whether that's in housing, in education, etc., etc. So it's not an either or. It's not incorporation or bust. It's there are already requirements there for the legislation to ensure that it does support and protect rights, and the Parliament in that role as the guarantor of rights has that key role. So looking to the next Parliament, there is that commitment from the current government, which may or may not be returned as a future government. So what there needs to be is an appetite and commitment from that new Parliament to support, protect and promote human rights through the legislative provisions, whether that's incorporation, full incorporation or across the legislative programme. And that also requires ensuring that there is a strong and robust independent national human rights institution. And so Jan's already mentioned where there's opportunity for, and we've highlighted a couple of the gaps in and limitations in our current mandate. And again, as this committee will be aware, the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body Office Holder Landscape Review report highlighted a positive case for reviewing the powers of the Commission. And that has to be, as again, I think I've said to this committee, it's, powers for a purpose. It's not about aggrandisement of the Commission. It's about making sure that the independent National Human Rights Institution has the most effective powers it needs to best serve people in Scotland. And so that's questions around taking cases in our own name, giving us that agility in the strategic legislation space that colleagues have raised today. And the other mechanisms around strengthening that legislative scrutiny and the scrutiny of actions of duty bearers. So that includes, for example, a national oversight mechanism on deaths in custody and deaths in detention. So within in parallel with the incorporation project, there needs to be a strong focus and support for a strong NHRI. So we are currently an A status national human rights institution in terms of the UN framework. And that means we have access to, we're at the top level of NHRIs that can participate in the UN monitoring process. That means that for the people of Scotland, there's eyes on Scotland. It means people are heard from Scotland into that international system. And we have submitted our paperwork for re-accreditation, and we'll go through the committee scrutiny of the subcommittee on accreditation within the human rights system in the early spring. And so we began that work within this reporting period. It's a very big process, as you might imagine. And so what you see reflected in our annual report has informed a significant part of our re-accreditation submission. And that's where the support of this committee and this Parliament for a fully mandated strong NHRI now and in the next Parliament is really important.
Thank you. The delay to legislation, does that have any impact on the Scottish Human Rights Framework?
The delay to legislation is about a delay to rights realised for individuals, because that's one of the main benefits of incorporation is that phrase of bringing rights home, so that rights can be actioned in the Scottish court system. So that's one of the most significant delays. But the changes to and support for a stronger NHRI in Scotland are not and should not be dependent on incorporation.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question from Tess White.
Thank you, Convener. The Chair said human rights feel increasingly precarious. So can you share with us what developments are behind the statement? Thank you.
Certainly. I mean, rights, when you look at across the evidence base of our spotlights, whether that's people in detention, people in institutional care, the access to justice questions that we've been discussing today, there is a dilution of delivery of rights. And so that means, and what your own questions highlighted, Ms White, around legal aid and where the most marginalised, most vulnerable people in our communities are increasingly removed from access to justice. Their rights are really precarious. In public and political discourse, where human rights are used as a means to divide people rather than unite, it makes rights precarious. Where rights are politicised, above and between and among different groups, rather than an adherence to that central character of rights being about the dignity and respect of the individual, where rights are weaponised as a reason not to act or to act against institutions, to give where rights are weaponised as a means to diminish the protection for individuals and the actions of institutions, that makes rights precarious and a further remove from the individuals. And so the kinds of things that we've seen in political discourse and on our streets in Scotland mean that rights are, if we're not careful, are increasingly precarious. And that's our message to this committee and to this Parliament, to be careful in the protection and promotion of rights. And that's not just ourselves as the Scotland's National Human Rights Institution saying that. We're hearing that from colleagues across Europe, from the Council of Europe Human Rights Commissioner, Michael O'Flaherty himself, talking about this is a collective effort. We secured these rights collectively through political and civil society institutions that resulted in the UN Declaration, that resulted in the European Convention, and it is incumbent upon us and those with a concern for strong democracies, strong civil societies and the well-being of our communities to protect the rights that we have and to avoid further erosion and political weaponising of rights.
I hear you, and I think this committee hears you. There are multiple layers to what you've just said, but then how can the Commission help navigate through that?
I think that's what we're trying to do every day by saying human rights are about people's everyday lives. They're not an importation, they're not a foreign interest or a conceptual distance. They're about social care, they're about access to transport, they're about access to legal aid, about access to residential care, about ensuring that your mum and dad can have a right to be in the same residential care home, that children have the rights that they do. It's about our everyday lives. It's about access to food, access to housing, access to transport, which we've shown very effectively in the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in the Highlands and Islands report, that is absolutely about the everyday. When we launched that report, I was asked in the first media interview I did, why were we talking about things like food and transport and housing? Because human rights are somehow or other, something a bit further away, and we think of it in terms of, international wars or whatever. And that's precisely the point, that human rights are about the everyday, and they are about the everyday responsibilities that our statutory local authorities, health boards, education providers, the Scottish Government and all the public bodies it funds are about securing the protection and promotion of rights. And that erosion is something that we're highlighting in our spotlights, and calling for a halt to that erosion and for a greater and more concentrated approach to making human rights and rights realisation at the core of public service and public service design in Scotland.
And I accept your point, but if you look at budgeting, human rights budgeting, and you did run an excellent workshop, you judge, and you say you almost judge on output. If you actually look at where spend is taking place, then that is politicised. And so, whoever's going to be leading the government after May next year, it is politicised. So you can't detach the two. So one could say that to actually think that you can't divorce politics from it is naive in the extreme. Take, for example, free speech. There's a huge debate going on right now about what is free speech and the right to free speech. And I suppose I hear what you say, and I think the committee has heard resoundingly what you've said. And you are a small but mighty team and been very effective in the first year, but you haven't got enough teeth to mandate anything. And even the absolutely super poignant comments about budgeting, it's flaccid. It's not going anywhere because the budget isn't going to change. We'll go through a budget round and human rights budgeting is like ninth after paperclips. So what guidance or input can you give to us as a committee that we get something like human rights budgeting right at the front of healthcare, of housing?
Oof, there's a lot to say in all of this. Parliamentary scrutiny that we have really laboured and sought to emphasise, the forceful interrogation of budget, the intent, and not politicising rights. By that I mean not making them party political. Of course, rights realisation is within the political process, and Parliament and the legislative programme and budget scrutiny that Parliament are engaged in are part of that political process. But by what we need to do is avoid the point scoring and party politicising of rights, and rather have a common understanding of the role of Parliament as the guarantor of human rights, and for this committee and other committees, because it needs to be across all committees, that there is really robust interrogation of spending proposals from a human rights perspective. Also understanding another point you made there about freedom of expression, and where the difference between absolute and qualified rights, and that there has to be that balance, that understanding that ultimately there has to be the realisation of dignity and respect for all, because rights are universal, and that requires the full engagement of Parliament in Chamber and across committees.
Jan would like to add something.
If that's okay, just some reflections from recent meetings with members and internationally as well, but reflecting on it's precisely at times of political turmoil that the integrity of the human rights framework and the institutions that exist to uphold the rule of law independently, so the courts, the judiciary, the national human rights institutions, that they must be protected and strengthened so that those protections for everyone's human rights can continue to be enjoyed. And in respect of how Parliament might be in a position to expect better adherence to the principles of human rights budgeting or human rights analysis in such critical public policy interventions such as the budget or such as proposed legislation, or at local level, that's where a version of a human rights bill for Scotland can then mandate those changes. So there's definitely conversations to be had into the next session of Parliament about, sensibly what's required to progress with the objectives of making rights real through public policy making, and there is advice that the Commission will continue to provide into that process. But just to reinforce that point around strengthening the independent mechanisms to uphold the integrity of the human rights framework is probably one of the most critical things that this Parliament could do at this juncture, to ensure that those rights are protected regardless of what happens next politically.
Thank you, Jan. We hear you. Back to you, convener.
Okay, thank you. And I have questions from... Oh, sorry, Maggie, did you want to come in on a supplementary? No. Okay.
Thanks, convener. And I'm conscious we're probably already over the time, but there's a couple of key things I think for me, and you kind of touched on it, Angela, in terms of this, because right at the intro you talked around about the participation strategy, and when this all comes down to the work that you do, it's all around about people. And it's about the lived experience. We can all talk about the politics of it and whatever around about it, but this is all about people and how it impacts on their lives. So one of the key things for me is how do you use that lived experience kind of going forward? Because we've had various evidence sessions, and what really strikes me in terms of that is when people actually tell you individually how it's impacting on them. So how do you then get that lived experience into the work that you're continuing to do? And I'd agree with you. I think there's a role, if we're talking around about the broader equalities agenda, this is not on it's political, but it's political for all of us, obviously on government more so, but it's politically on all of us to make sure that we do that. The political discourse at the moment is just awful when we're talking about equalities. But coming back to the lived experience, I don't know what you can say any more on that, and yourself as well, Jan, just about how we actually make that real as possible.
Thank you very much. One of the innovations in this period, in the reporting period that we're talking about today, is the participation strategy, which is a formal sort of declaration, if you like, from the Commission, from the Scottish Human Rights Commission, that participation is the means, we mean for participation to characterise how we work as Scotland's national human rights institution. So that is about amplifying the voices of rights holders. It's about taking that challenge to duty bearers. National human rights institutions are often described as the bridge between citizens and the state, and that is absolutely our role. And so having a formal participation strategy is a first step in embedding that as a way of working in the Commission, and we've introduced what we hope are good practice elements there in terms of supporting effective participation, paying people for their participation and recognising the time and financial cost that it takes to engage but beyond consultation as well. And going beyond consultation is how I would characterise our work with the human rights defenders in the TikTok project and deinstitutionalisation, how we've sought to support Scottish Gypsy Traveller communities participate in the Spotlight report, how we've worked with prison communities and people in detention around prison complaints and the prison rules review. So, and again, it's something that we're monitoring through, going back to the very first question about how do we measure our success. Well, how do we measure our success? By how well we're known, who we're working with and how we're working with people, bringing that lived experience. And so what you'll see is next week we're launching our State of the Nation, which will have clear personal stories of individuals that we've worked with across the year, again out with this reporting period, but that in everything we do, I mean, an example would be our evidence to, or two examples really, the cost of living crisis reporting into the Council of Europe, and then our reporting into the UN Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, bringing forward that evidence from the engagement we've had with, for example, the Human Rights Housing Project in Castlemilk, and various other community reports, including Cable Wines Housing and other housing, human rights housing projects. So bringing all of that lived experience to the attention of this committee, to Parliament and to the international scrutiny bodies as well. So absolutely characterises how we're working.
Yeah. Jan, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
Yeah, just I suppose something that we're really proud of in the Commission. It's really easy in a strategic plan to say we're going to, respect the humanity of the people standing beside us, and we're going to put the human into human rights, and to do all that good stuff. But we have put the money where our mouth is. We have developed a 4-year participation strategy, which is influencing the skill set that we've recruited into the Commission. It's influencing everything that we do in respect of how we engage with people. And what I often say to the members of the Commission is, my hope is that we won't always need a participation strategy, because actually that just becomes how we do things in the Commission. But it's going to take us a 4-year period to really properly embed it in our practice. And what we're really proud of, our participation officers have been over sharing it as best practice with other national human rights institutions across Europe, because it is, in fairness, something that institutions like ours sometimes struggle to get right. Not so much in Scotland, I have to say, but so no, we're determined for it not to be a tokenistic phrase. And I would commend the strategy to you, and I'll make sure you've got a copy of it post the meeting.
And that's key. I suppose then the final question for me would be, 5 years from now, we are sitting here and we're having the same kind of session in terms of that. So what does success look like, for example, in terms of what Scottish Government does, what the Parliament does, and what the wider public sector kind of does? So if we were sitting here in 5 years going, this was where we want to get to for Government, for Parliament and for the wider Scottish public sector, what does that look like? And I know that's a big, wide question, but what does that kind of look like in a few key objectives? Because again, I think it's on the role of us, yes, as government, as parliamentarians and the wider public sector, to come back and go, you told us 5 years ago we have to deliver on this, and it's up to all of us, every single one of us, to deliver on that for you.
Yeah. I think there's some key success factors there, of starting with the reality of people's everyday lives. You know, are there fewer people in poverty? Are there more people accessing adequate, appropriate, accessible healthcare that is of a quality that is needed? And are public services being designed in such a way that they will, and resourced in such a way that they will realise, make real those objectives and outcomes? And are service providers across public bodies designing their own reporting and evaluation mechanisms from a human rights perspective? Are they effectively realising people's rights? We have our own success factors as an organisation as well, so in strengthening our organisation and securing a strengthened national human rights institution for the people of Scotland over the course of the next 5-year Parliament absolutely is one of our key objectives. And there was something else I was going to say that's completely gone out of my head, so I'll pass to Jan. I don't remember.
Just to say, that's exactly the reason that we invested in developing a theory of change for the Commission, so that we could demonstrate over a longer period of time. And let's face it, it's going to be longer than 5 years to sort of shift the sorts of societal changes that we're looking at here. But through that theory of change, we sort of identify that ultimately what we're looking to see is, reduced number of human rights violations for individuals. We want to see a strengthened legal framework to protect everyone's human rights. We want to see greater vehicles for access to justice, and we want to see public services designed and delivered in a way that's compliant. And critically, we don't want to see retrogression. So where things have achieved a certain standard, we don't want to see things getting worse. So that theory of change that we've developed is the longer term impact measurement mechanism, I suppose, for the Commission, and will be a long term opportunity for us to look back against every strategic planning cycle, actually, to say on a 4-year cycle, how are we doing? So it's a great question, and I assure you it's a question we're asking ourselves every day with every piece of work that we take on and every decision that we make.
And it's a challenge that we have to accept, and I think that's the key thing for us. As I said, as parliamentarians, it's a challenge we have to accept. And if we are back in 5 years and asking the same question, and we failed, then it's fairness on us all. It's not just on government or parliament; it's fairness on all. So, yeah.
That's the point that went from my mind when I was speaking, which is about a strong committee. That in the next parliamentary session, that there is a strong oversight committee on human rights, equality, human rights, civil justice committee. That is, there's proposals in the landscape review report for a pilot committee, but that's about scrutiny of the office holder body. What we are concerned to ensure is that there is effective scrutiny around human rights realisation and protection across Parliament, and so a strong lead committee with strong members and that strong relationship across other committees. While this committee can give the lead, it's essential that there is that engagement and a human rights perspective from across all the parliamentary committees. It's not the sole business of this committee, it's the business of Parliament to secure the protection and realisation of rights.
And I think that's an ideal way to finish that. Convener, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Paul, I'd just like to come in at the end there, just thinking about those expectations and perhaps priorities of the Scottish Government, particularly going into the next session and looking at human rights. But we can't escape the fact that we are, and rightly so, focusing on the Scottish Government and this Parliament, but we are a devolved government. We are behest to a UK government who still has a lot of reserved powers, and we are also behest to local authorities and their priorities, like the committee did some work on public sector equality duty, for example. And how does that factor into your priorities, the expectations you have, taking account of some restrictions perhaps and boundaries that there are, if we look at the UNCRC, for example, and how that was watered down. So there are quite crossover challenges in terms of government, but also it's quite complex when we're looking at human rights within the devolved Parliament's competencies. So how do you face those challenges?
The Scottish Human Rights Commission is a very active partner in the international framework, both the international monitoring framework through the UN, but as well as through the networks of the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions and the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. And so we are actively raising many of the issues that you have raised, with and alongside our sister national human rights institutions, which are the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is the Human Rights National Human Rights Institution for England and Wales, the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. So we work in partnership, in concert with our sister NHRIs through the international system, and increasingly in the domestic sphere in relation to the UK government. Jan might speak a wee bit more about that, having just been engaged with the Ministry of Justice there. There are opportunities again for this Parliament to engage internationally around the protection of our domestic rights framework, and to speak up and speak out about challenges to that framework, whether that's some of the proposals that are yet lacking in detail but are signalling some political messaging around Article 8 and other protections within the European Convention, and indeed the integrity of the European Convention itself is something that we all, I think, have a collective responsibility to be concerned about, and to avoid that and halt that erosion, and the challenges that there are to that security of the European Convention at the international level. There's a meeting next week within the Council of Europe structure, where there are concerted efforts from national governments to challenge the European Convention, and so having the voice of the Scottish Parliament as a counter-challenge to those efforts or proposals to weaken the Convention are important, just as they are with the UK government. And in terms of strengthening the powers and mandate of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, there are implications with the GB Human Rights Act. So again, there's conversations to have with and through this Parliament with the UK government. But Jan might like to say something about.
Just the complexity is inevitable, given the devolved context and the circumstances across Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Certainly, the Scottish Human Rights Commission, in no small way prompted by the process of re-accreditation that we have to go through internationally to demonstrate Paris principle compliance. We've been working closely with the Ministry of Justice to ensure that their continued commitment to the devolved framework of national human rights institutions is absolutely a continued priority of the UK government, and we've had written confirmation that that's the case. So that's important. It's incumbent upon us as NHRIs, as much as it's incumbent upon governments then now to liaise on the implications of this framework on how each country wishes to take forward greater compliance with human rights standards. What that means for the incorporation agenda moving forward will ultimately absolutely require more collaboration, and that will shift depending on the political nature of the relationships that exist at any given time. The current membership of the current Scottish Human Rights Commission are very, very clear that whilst the enabling powers within the Scottish Commission for Human Rights Act are only applicable to devolved areas of competence, the Scottish Human Rights Commission mandate is to speak out and to have an interest on any matter which impacts on any person living in Scotland in respect of their human rights enjoyment. And so that does give the Scottish Human Rights Commission the opportunity to give more advice and to speak out more often on some of those different areas of policy that might absolutely originate from Westminster and will be controlled by Westminster, but have an impact on how human rights are being enjoyed here in Scotland. And so there's a real clarity of appreciation of the mandate of the Scottish Human Rights Commission in that space, and commitment from the current membership to drive us in that direction. So yeah, and in respect of the responsibilities of local councils and devolved government, that's probably an area I get quite exercised about now, given our size and scale, 16 staff, and the work that we've now started in Highlands and Islands in particular. You can see actually the real value in the Commission working alongside devolved local government in a bit more of a supportive fashion to ensure that things can be taken forward. That's a resource constraint that we have in our way. So, but there's lots to explore. There's absolutely, the complexities don't go anywhere. But I think by getting them on the table and being aware of them, that we'll find our way through that, and that's the commitment of the Commission.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. I think just having that golden thread running through everything, help trying to tie that together, does make a difference. You were saying earlier about human rights and what they mean on the ground. For example, library closures in my constituency, trying to educate our constituents on how that is a human right to have that valued service in their area, but ensuring that not just that education's there, but like all spheres of government have that as a priority and know and understand that as well. So that's a helpful side note to know that you're working on that as well. Thank you. And we'll have a supplementary from Pam Gossel, please.
To correct the records, convener.
Okay, no problem.
I wanted to correct the records. I'm not sure I made it clear that the Highland woman actually contacted 116 different lawyers, and I think I phrased it in a way that's saying that she contacted 116 times. So it's just to correct the record on the committee. It was 116 different lawyers she contacted. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Ms Gossel. Okay, thank you. That brings this session to a close. Thank you very much again for your time. Thank members for participation. We will now close and go into private session to discuss the remaining items on our agenda.